Hi, everyone.
Hi. In our prior segments on Revelation, we got to chapter 16, the one Armageddon text in the Bible, where the place is named anyway. And we pointed out that even the Watchtower has granted that, at least in the Old Testament, this has a geographical reference, and there's quite a bit of information about battles that occurred there, including the most tragic one from a Jewish standpoint, the death of Josiah at Megiddo. So, although the Watchtower admits it has local reference, geographical reference in the Old Testament, they don't want to do that in the New Testament, for reasons, of course, of their own, in view of their general eschatological assumptions about the last days. And before we visited the text, that is Revelation 16 by itself, and made connections within Revelation, we thought it necessary to go back and fill in some of the background, because of course the early readers, or listeners probably more accurately, of the book of Revelation in the first century and beyond, would have a very heavy Old Testament emphasis already, because that was their Bible. They had no New Testament in those days. They had only the Old, whether it be in Greek or Hebrew.
So they'd be very familiar with it, having heard it read over and over again.
So when they heard the word Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo, they would make certain connections that we don't necessarily make. And they would fill in the blanks. And one of the things you don't observe when you're a Jehovah's Witness, and I dare say Christians might not notice it either, is that in the book of Revelation, neither Rome nor Jerusalem, the earthly city, are ever mentioned by name. So if you're going to find Rome, the most important city in the world in Revelation, you have to look to symbols and descriptions. And also the same with Jerusalem. If you're going to find Jerusalem at all in the last day scenario, you're going to have to read the descriptions very carefully.
Yeah, and you can understand, some people have said that the book of Revelation is written in code, not just pictures, but in code. And that's understandable, since it's being written to a church that's being persecuted. So if they were worried about this being found by someone and then naming certain things very just up front, they could get in trouble. So they would hide a lot of stuff, but it wouldn't prevent the Jewish people from understanding, because of their background knowledge of the Old Testament.
Yeah. So we thought it best, because of the fact that so few of us read the Old Testament first, if we're Christians, and certainly Jehovah's Witnesses, let's fill in the background, because there are at least 7 angles on the book of Revelation, and Revelation itself, I should say on the word Armageddon in Revelation, and because the word only occurs once, you need the other 6 angles that came before. And I'm not saying there's only 6. There's, I think, multiple references in the Old Testament to a final showdown between God and his own people, and God and the Gentiles who are persecuting his people. So when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you don't think in terms of God judging his people and also judging those who aren't his people.
Right.
And yet those concepts are both very, very tied together in the Old Testament prophets. You go from a judgment upon Israel and Jerusalem to the ultimate blessing on Jerusalem and Israel, back and forth all the time.
And in between, those judgments happening through the nations, and then the nations being judged based on their ill treatment of Israel.
And Joel is a classic text. And so we thought the 6 scenarios that we definitely need from the Old Testament are 4 from the major prophets, all 4 of the major prophets, but we've already dealt with the Daniel version of it, the final showdown, the showdown over his people in Daniel 11:12, so we'll link to that at the end of this video. And also the Zechariah one, we've talked much about that before, and we'll link to those. But of the 4 remaining, you have 1 minor prophet, Joel, and the 3 other major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And Joel might be the first, so it's good first to go to Joel first, because it might be the earliest chronologically, and that tends to be important in the Bible, that if you know what the mother text says, you can then more easily decode the later text and more easily understand the references. And so it is with Joel. If you go to Joel chapter 3, which is where we'll end up, a text that's pretty unfamiliar to us when we're Jehovah's Witnesses. There are a couple of texts in Joel that are very familiar from their references either in the Watchtower or in the New Testament. For instance, we'll get to Joel 2:32 in a minute, which is quoted by Peter on the day of Pentecost. But recently, the vision of the locusts in Joel has got a lot of attention in the ex-JW community because of the reversal of the interpretation that the Watchtower has undertaken recently. But it is good to always start at the beginning of a Bible book just to get your bearings in terms of locality and target audience. And so it is with Joel. Good to read the first 3 verses.
Okay. The word of Jehovah that occurred to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, you older men, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has this occurred in your days, or even in the days of your forefathers? Concerning it, give an account to your own sons, and your sons to their sons, and their sons to the following generation.
It is thought that the book of Joel is either very early in the prophetic picture or very late, and I think this definitely recommends very early because of the later judgments on his people involving the literal locust plague. We're told in the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy that those agricultural plagues will precede exile, precede invasion and exile. So if the locusts are about invasion, and I think even the Watchtowers conceded that lately, they're about pagan or heathen invasions of Israel. This agricultural plague, which obviously has a reference to literal plagues in the first case, with which they were familiar. This is a necessary prelude to understanding the rest. And of course the locusts, for one symbols, if you want to look at them symbolically, show up in Revelation as well. But here you have the command, pass on this prophecy.
Yeah, tell your children, and they'll tell their children. So that's why later, when Peter's talking, he's just paraphrasing the Old Testament. He's quoting it like it's very familiar.
Yeah.
And that explains that it would be very familiar because every generation was hearing it being repeated over and over again.
They would hear the law and the prophets over and over again in the synagogues from childhood. So it's very likely that Peter himself had this text memorized when he called it forth on the day of Pentecost,
right, yeah.
knowing its fulfillment. But that leaps over almost 2 chapters of Joel, where the locust plague and all the subsequent judgments on Jerusalem and Judah are all detailed for us. But the judgments on Jerusalem and Judah aren't the end of the story, according to chapter 2, verse 32, which, if you're a witness, you are familiar with. And it reads in the silver sword, everyone who calls on the name of Jehovah will be saved. But you don't notice the B part. What does that say?
The B part is, for in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will prove to be the escaped ones, just as Jehovah has said, and in among the survivors whom Jehovah is calling.
So obviously Peter thinks that's being literally fulfilled in his day, because where is he standing when he applies this to the present?
He's
in Acts chapter 2.
In Jerusalem.
So the escapees, as it were, from Judaism and who are now escaping into Christianity to get away from the judgment day of Jehovah, which, as we know, came within a generation of that Pentecost sermon. However, you'd miss the rest, which is chapter 3 is the end of the story. As with all of God's judgments, and here's where you need Peter. The Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter 4:17 that judgment starts with the house of God. So if you as a Jehovah's Witness are familiar with that generation and the fulfillment of the prophecies literally upon that generation of Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem again, you note that prophecy is being literally fulfilled upon the people of Israel. And you might think of verses like, and Jerusalem will be trampled upon until the times of the Gentiles are over. But immediately before that, we're told that the people, the sword will come upon the people, and they will be scattered throughout the nations, literally Gentiles. So you see that there's a literal fulfillment of judgment upon Israel, but you don't see the very next verse predicts that something else will follow up on that. Though this is not the end of the story for either Israel or Jerusalem. So look, for instance, at the next 2 verses and see where Joel's mind goes after that.
For look, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring back the captive ones of Judah and Jerusalem, and I will also collect together all the nations, and bring them down to the low plain of Jehoshaphat, and I will put myself on judgment with them there on account of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they scattered among the nations, and they apportioned out my own land.
So, for instance, in Luke 21, with which we are all familiar if we're Jehovah's Witnesses, and we use it selectively at the door, you have the Jews being scattered all over the world and Jerusalem being trampled on, but your translation, of course, doesn't say Gentiles. It
says nations.
The
So then you
appointed
don't
times of
see
nations.
any distinction between Israel and Israelites and the rest, all the other nations.
But the verse we're more familiar with, of course, is the next verse, 24, in Luke 21, where it says that the trampling will continue until the times of the Gentiles, or the appointed times of the nations, are fulfilled. Then what? Well, here's the then what. What will God do at the end of those times? He will bring back the captives of Judah and Jerusalem and gather together all the nations and bring them. He doesn't say send them down. Bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And if you want to, we won't refer to it now, but check out 2 Chronicles chapter 20 here, because this was etched in the memory of every Jew, that there was a showdown once before between Jehoshaphat, who's the king of Judah, and the nations round about, who allied together and assembled together and were destroyed by their own hands in the battle, the subsequent battle. And God says, stand still and see the deliverance of Yahweh, and they don't have to do anything. So this was carved in the memory of every Jew, that this was a miraculous deliverance of the people of Israel one more time in the past, when they didn't have an unblemished track record at the time. Solomon was only a couple of generations in the past. There was a lot of bad stuff, but God delivered them nevertheless. And that seems to be the reference here to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which means Jehovah judges. So at this particular time in history, it says, I will gather them together, all these nations, and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat and enter into judgment with them there. Why?
On account of my people, my inheritance Israel, who scattered them among the nations, and apportioned out my own land. So he seems to care not only about the people, but the land.
We don't think of that when we're witnesses.
No.
God has attached his purposes to this land. So if you go on, the next few verses are about the various abuses of the people of Jerusalem and Judah. Over the centuries, they were abused, they were enslaved, they were continued to be in exile. Is that the end of the story? So by the time you get to verse 9, you have the rest of the story.
Proclaim this, you people, among the nations. Sanctify war. Arouse the powerful men. Let them draw near. Let them come up, all the men of war. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning shears into lances. As for the weak one, let him say, I am a powerful man. Lend your aid and come, all you nations round about, and collect yourselves together. To that place, O Jehovah, bring your powerful ones down. Let the nations be aroused and come up to the low plain of Jehoshaphat, for there I shall sit in order to judge all the nations round about. Thrust in a sickle, for harvest has grown ripe. Come, descend, for the winepress has become full. The press vats actually overflow, for their badness has become abundant. Crowds are in the low plain of the decision, for the day of Jehovah is near in the low plain of the decision. Sun and moon themselves will certainly become dark, and the very stars will actually withdraw their brightness. And out of Zion Jehovah himself will roar, and out of Jerusalem he will give forth his voice. And heaven and earth certainly will rock, but Jehovah will be a refuge for his people, and a fortress for the sons of Israel. And you people will have to know that I am Jehovah, your God, residing in Zion, my holy mountain. And Jerusalem must become a holy place, and as regards strangers, they will no more pass through her. And it must occur in that day that the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and the very hills will flow with milk, and the very stream beds of Judah will all flow with water. And out of the house of Jehovah there will go forth a spring, and it must irrigate the torrent valley of the acacia trees. As regards Egypt, a desolate waste it will become, and as regards Edom, a wilderness of desolate waste. It will become because of the violence to the sons of Judah, in whose land they shed innocent blood. But as for Judah, to time indefinite it will be inhabited, and Jerusalem to generation after generation. And I will consider innocent their blood that I had not considered innocent, and Jehovah will be residing in Zion.
When I read this as a Jehovah's Witness in the last phase of my involvement, even before I resigned as an elder, I had to say game over. There's just too many references in here that are local, geographical, specific, for us to just shake it all off and say, well, it must be symbolic, because, as we are prone to do if we're Jehovah's Witnesses. For instance, in verse 11, come and help all you surrounding nations assemble together to that place, O Jehovah, and then bring down your powerful ones. And when I got to that verse as a Jehovah's Witness, I of course called to mind Matthew 25, the very last of Jesus' parables in Matthew, the sheep and the goats, where you read that when the Son of Man arrives in his glory, then all the nations will be gathered in front of him. But he will come with his angels, it says in there, right? Here it says, bring down your powerful ones, O Jehovah. And then it says in verse 12, let them be roused and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, a literal place in Israel, for there I will sit in order to judge all the surrounding nations. And I thought, So you won't notice that as a Jehovah's Witness, and if you do, you won't make the necessary connection. And then there's a literal connection to Revelation in the very next verse. Thrust in a sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come down and tread, for the winepress is full. Well, remember back in our video on Revelation 14, you read that the harvest is ripe, and that
and there's a mention of a sickle and a winepress.
And it begins to be trodden outside the city, but there's no mention of which city it is. In the context, you can only guess it's either Babylon, which is mentioned, or Zion. And here it's plainly a localized one, because Jehoshaphat was a king of Judah. So everybody who read that in the original, in Joel, but also in Revelation, would make the connection that we don't necessarily make. This is a localized judgment. And the very fact that Jehovah himself is doing the judging, well, as a Jehovah's Witness, you can't cope with that.
No.
He is personally present in judgment. And then you get to verse 16, and Jehovah will roar out of Zion, and out of Jerusalem he will raise his voice, and heaven and earth will rock. Revelation 16 verse 18, right after the Armageddon text, says that there will be a great earthquake such as has not occurred. And we know that Christ also referred to a great tribulation such as has never been since the earth began. And Ezekiel mentions it, and Zechariah mentions it. They're just references that pile on top of each other. But even if you just had this one, as a Jehovah's Witness, wouldn't you be uncomfortable if someone showed you this?
Yeah, if you're paying attention to details, for sure. You know, so the first time I ever did that was after I'd left the witnesses and decided just to read the Bible straight through without watchtower glasses on and believe what I read unless there was good evidence in the text not to think it was literal. And this was very disturbing.
And it's not so much even the what of what is happening here, whether it's literal or symbolic. Here it's plainly literal, a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the why, 16b. Why does it say all this will have to happen?
But Jehovah will be a refuge for his people and a fortress for the sons of Israel.
And you will have to know that I am Jehovah,
Your God,
residing in Zion. So if the Jews don't know Jesus and don't know even their own God, when will they know? Will they never know? And will the nations never know that God honors his ancient promises? Well, it plainly says here, you will have to know.
And, you know, you can't spiritualize it. It says, and Jerusalem must become a holy place. Well, heaven has always been holy. So it's talking about a Jerusalem which had become unclean in judgment.
And still is.
Mm-hmm.
And still will be, apparently, for a long time to come, and at least until the Lord shows up personally. And then you have in the very last reference what plainly connects to the trampling of Jerusalem in Luke 21:24. Strangers will pass through her no more. So there's a guarantee, not just here, but many places in the prophets, that one day Jerusalem will be purified, but that will only be when God himself is ruling there. And here it plainly says, it connects those two thoughts. Residing in Zion, my holy mountain. So has God ever given up on that place? And if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have to say, of course he gave up on it, because they broke his law and they killed his son. Well, that's not what it says here. And then you have paradise text, right? Verse 18, in that day the mountains will drip with sweet wine, the hills will flow with milk, and the streams of Judah will all flow with water. Out of the house of Jehovah a spring will flow, and it will irrigate the valley of the acacia trees, which is capitalized, indicating it is also a literal place. Even in the New World Translation, it's capitalized.
Yes, it is, yeah.
So, paradise, but is it paradise earth? Because read verse 19 again in there.
Verse 19 says, as regards Egypt, a desolate waste it will become. And as regards Edom, a wilderness of desolate waste it will become, because of the violence to the sons of Judah, in whose land they shed innocent blood.
Again, then why? Why are these nations exempted from redemption promises? And Edom is not just mentioned here, it's mentioned explicitly in Isaiah chapter 34 and Ezekiel 35, right in the middle of restoration promises for Israel. You have this, that Edom is going to be, and Edom therefore will be a monument to his judgment, just as Israel will be a monument to his faithfulness in mercy. Because of the violence done to the people of Judah. By the way, the word Judah generates the word Jews. So when you talk about the origins of anti-Semitism, and that it still prevails to this day, you have both the affirmation of why it happened in God's judgment on his own people, their continued exile, but one day they will be restored to the land, according to this, in unbelief still, but then that too will be resolved.
Verse 21, right? I will consider innocent their blood that I had not considered innocent, and Jehovah will be residing in Zion.
So is that a clear indication that they will be forgiven as a people? That doesn't mean every Jew will be forgiven or accepted. It means that as a people they will finally be redeemed. And
they will finally recognize. They will finally know. I mean, that was verse 17. That they would, what was it, verse 17? Where it said that they would know
that I am Jehovah.
That I am Jehovah, your God.
Your God.
So, you know, there's a recognition here at some point. So
Christians believe that Christ will show up, and because Christians, of course, believe that he is God incarnate, they can reconcile all of these texts. But as a witness, you can't.
Yeah, so when you have this God sitting and judging the nations and separating them, a Christian can see the parallel with Jesus saying that he would sit and judge and separate the sheep and the goats.
Yeah.
They have no trouble with it because somebody has, or because they're reading the entire text, they can lay those two beside each other. But as a witness, you never have those two things laid beside each other.
No. Nor can you take literally verse 20. But Judah will always be inhabited, and Jerusalem to generation after generation.
Mm-hmm.
So people are still going to be born in this new world. Yes, it's not the new heavens and new earth of Revelation 21.
Mm-hmm.
But Christians are divided, and we have to say that. Christians are divided as to whether there will be such a literal fulfillment. But I myself saw that I couldn't reconcile these texts without assuming a literal fulfillment. So, in a subsequent video, we're going to talk about Isaiah's testimony. He seems to be second in chronological order when it comes to the Armageddon scenario. So Isaiah's angle and Isaiah's witness in the next segment. And we'll also link those two videos we mentioned at the beginning. Actually, there's more than two, but they're on two subjects. Daniel 11 and 12, and also Zechariah 14. So we'll put those on the screen now.